The HIV test results arrived at Sheikh Omar Al Nahyan's private medical clinic on October 14, 2022, shattering the carefully constructed world of a 52-year-old real estate magnate whose family's investments had shaped Dubai's skyline for 3 generations. The diagnosis was undeniable. HIV positive, with viral markers suggesting infection had occurred approximately 8 months earlier, during the period when he believed himself untouchable, protected by wealth, power, and the kind of immunity that money purchases in cities where influence matters more than law. Within hours of receiving his diagnosis, Sheikh Omar was reviewing security footage from his Palm Jumeirah villa, tracking back through months of encounters, searching for the source of an infection that would destroy his reputation, devastate his family, and potentially end his life. The footage revealed what he had been too arrogant to suspect. His mistress of 14 months, a 31-year-old Filipina named Sophia Reyes, had known she was HIV positive before their affair began, and she had deliberately infected him as calculated revenge for a crime he had committed 3 years earlier. That crime was the death of Sophia's younger sister, Maria, a 24-year-old domestic worker who had died in February 2019 after falling from the 3rd-floor balcony of Sheikh Omar's brother's residence. The official investigation had concluded accidental death, the family had paid blood money to avoid further scrutiny, and Maria's case had been closed with the bureaucratic efficiency that protects powerful families from inconvenient questions about dead domestic workers. But Sophia had never believed the accident story. She had spent 3 years planning revenge so methodical and devastating that it would destroy Sheikh Omar as completely as his family had destroyed hers. She had researched his patterns, identified his vulnerabilities, and deliberately contracted HIV from a positive partner before initiating the affair that would weaponize her own body into an instrument of irreversible justice. This isn't just a story about revenge. This is about what happens when legal systems fail victims so completely that they create vigilantes willing to destroy themselves to achieve justice. It's about the rage that builds when powerful men kill poor women and pay money to make consequences disappear. And it's about a question with no easy answer. When the system refuses to deliver justice, does a victim have the right to become an executioner? Stay with us, because what Sophia did was unquestionably criminal, methodically planned, and morally indefensible by any legal standard. But understanding why she did it requires examining a justice system that values Emirati lives infinitely more than Filipino lives, and a culture where domestic workers die with such frequency that their deaths barely register as newsworthy unless someone powerful decides to notice. Maria Grace Reyes was born on June 3, 1995, in Tacloban City, Leyte, a coastal province in the eastern Visayas that would become internationally known in 2013 when Typhoon Haiyan devastated the region, killing over 6,000 people and leaving survivors to rebuild from catastrophic destruction. Maria's family had survived the typhoon physically but emerged financially destroyed, their small fishing business obliterated, and their home reduced to debris that smelled of salt water and shattered dreams. She was the youngest of 3 sisters raised by their widowed mother, Elena, who worked as a seamstress earning perhaps 150 pesos daily, roughly $3. Income that covered rice and vegetables but not much else. Their father had died in 2011 from complications of untreated diabetes, a death that was preventable with proper medical care but inevitable for poor Filipinos who couldn't afford the medications and monitoring that would have saved his life. Maria was different from her sisters. Sophia, the eldest, was pragmatic and hard, shaped by years of supporting the family. Lucia, the middle child, was quiet and artistic, finding beauty in circumstances that offered little. But Maria was optimistic and trusting, believing in people's fundamental goodness even when experience should have taught her otherwise. She laughed easily, made friends naturally, and approached life with hopefulness that seemed almost naive to those who knew how cruel the world could be to poor young women from the provinces. After Typhoon Haiyan, with their family home destroyed and their mother's seamstress business eliminated by flooding that ruined her sewing machine and all her materials, the 3 sisters made a pact. They would all work overseas, pool their remittances, and rebuild their family's security within 5 years. It was a common strategy among Filipino families: sacrifice the present generation's happiness to secure the next generation's opportunities. Sophia, at 23 in 2014, went first to Dubai as a domestic worker, sending money home that allowed Lucia to finish college and Maria to complete a caregiving and household management certificate program. By 2018, all three sisters were working in the UAE, Sophia as a housemaid in Dubai, Lucia as a hospital cleaner in Abu Dhabi, and Maria, having arrived in November 2018, as a domestic worker for the Al Nahyan family in their Dubai villa. Maria's placement with the Al Nahyans seemed like good fortune. The family was wealthy and connected, with real estate and construction investments throughout the Gulf. They paid competitive wages, provided proper accommodation, and had a reputation for treating staff reasonably well, by the low standards of Dubai's domestic worker industry, where reasonable treatment meant not being physically beaten and receiving regular days off. The household consisted of Hamza Al Nahyan, Sheikh Omar's younger brother, his wife Amira, and their three children aged 8, 6, and 3. Maria's duties included general housekeeping, childcare assistance, meal preparation, and the endless cleaning that Dubai's desert climate demanded. She worked from 6 a.m. until 9 p.m. most days, sent 1,200 of her 1,500 dirham monthly salary home, $327 of $410, and lived in a small room in the staff quarters that was hot in summer and adequate the rest of the year. Her letters home during her first 3 months were optimistic. The family was demanding but not cruel. The children were sweet if exhausting. The work was hard, but she was managing. She attended Mass at the Filipino Catholic Church on her monthly day off, made friends among other domestic workers, and video-called home weekly with updates that made her mother cry with relief that at least one daughter seemed to be thriving. But by February 2019, just 3 months into her employment, Maria's communications had changed tone. Her calls became less frequent and more subdued. When Sophia pressed her about what was wrong, Maria initially deflected, claiming only exhaustion and homesickness. But during a call on February 10, 2019, Maria finally confessed what was happening. Hamza had been making inappropriate advances that had escalated from uncomfortable compliments to physical touching to explicit propositions that made continuing to work in the household feel impossible. He waits until his wife is out, then he corners me in the kitchen or laundry room, Maria told Sophia, her voice breaking. He touches my waist, my shoulders, tries to kiss me. Yesterday he grabbed my breast and said I should be grateful for his attention. I don't know what to do. If I complain to Madame Amira, she might not believe me, or worse, she might blame me and have me deported. But I can't keep working here, Sophia. I'm so scared. Sophia's advice was cautious and practical. Document everything. Avoid being alone with Hamza when possible. Start looking for alternative employment through the agency, but don't quit suddenly because that would forfeit salary owed and potentially trigger visa problems. She promised to help Maria find a new placement, told her to be strong for just a few more weeks until they could arrange a safe transition. But Maria didn't have a few more weeks. On February 24, 2019, at approximately 3:30 p.m. according to the official investigation timeline, Maria Grace Reyes fell from the third-floor balcony of the Al Nahyan villa and died of massive head trauma before the ambulance arrived. She was 23 years old, had been in Dubai for exactly 108 days, and died owing her recruitment agency 20,000 pesos, roughly $400, that would be collected from her grieving mother within weeks of her death. The Dubai police investigation into Maria's death was perfunctory and predetermined. The responding officers, both Emirati men whose cultural training taught them to defer to prominent families, arrived to find Maria's body on the ground floor patio beneath the third-floor master bedroom balcony. Hamza and Amira were present, both expressing shock and grief, explaining that Maria had been cleaning the balcony railings when she apparently lost her balance and fell. The physical evidence told a more complicated story that investigators chose not to examine thoroughly. Maria's body showed bruising on her upper arms consistent with being gripped forcefully. Her uniform was torn at the shoulder, and the location where her body landed, several feet from the base of the building, suggested she had been pushed or thrown rather than simply falling straight down as would occur if someone lost balance while cleaning railings. Most significantly, there were no cleaning supplies on or near the balcony. No bucket, no rags, no cleaning solutions, nothing that would support the story that Maria had been engaged in balcony cleaning when she fell. When investigators asked about this discrepancy, Hamza explained that Maria must have already taken the supplies back inside before the fall, a timeline that made no logical sense but was accepted without challenge. The autopsy revealed additional concerning evidence. Maria had recent bruising on her thighs and defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, injuries that suggested a struggle shortly before her death. But the medical examiner's report characterized these as consistent with possible fall-related trauma and noted that domestic workers often had unexplained bruises from their work duties, a statement that revealed how normalized violence against this population had become. Sophia arrived in Dubai from her own employment within 24 hours of learning about her sister's death. She demanded to see the police report, insisted on additional investigation, and tried to explain that Maria had been experiencing sexual harassment that provided clear motive for violence. But her complaints were dismissed through a combination of bureaucratic indifference and active obstruction. The investigating officer told Sophia bluntly that reopening the case would require substantial evidence beyond her suspicions, that accusations against prominent families were serious matters that could result in defamation charges against her if unproven, and that as a foreign domestic worker she should be careful about making allegations that could affect her own visa status and employment. The subtext was clear. Maria was a poor Filipino maid whose death was unfortunate, but ultimately inconsequential to people who mattered. The Alnayan family were wealthy, connected Emiratis whose reputation needed protection from scandalous allegations. The investigation would conclude as accidental death. The family would pay blood money as required by Islamic tradition, and everyone would move forward as if Maria's life had value only in the financial transaction that closed her case. The blood money payment was 100,000 dirhams, roughly $27,000, a sum calculated based on Islamic jurisprudence about the value of human life, but that in practice revealed the vast disparity between how the system valued Emirati lives versus foreign worker lives. Had an Emirati woman died under similar circumstances, blood money would likely have exceeded 200,000 dirhams, and the investigation would have been far more thorough. Sophia wanted to refuse the money, to insist on justice rather than financial settlement. But her mother was desperate. Elena had lost her youngest daughter and now faced debt collectors demanding repayment of Maria's recruitment loans plus interest. The money would cover those debts, pay for a proper funeral, and provide some financial security for a mother who had now lost her breadwinner and her emotional anchor. The money was accepted on March 15, 2019, and Maria's case was officially closed. Her body was repatriated to the Philippines, where she was buried in Tacloban's public cemetery in a grave that her family could barely afford to mark with a simple concrete cross bearing her name and dates. The funeral was attended by dozens of friends and family who mourned a young woman whose dreams of helping her family had ended with her body broken on marble tile in a country that would never hold her killer accountable. Sophia stood at that grave and made a promise that only she could hear. Maria's death would not be forgotten. Her killer would not escape consequences, and one day the Alnayan family would understand that some debts can't be settled with money. The transformation of Sophia Reyes from grieving sister into methodical instrument of revenge didn't happen overnight. It unfolded across 3 years of research, planning, and preparation that required Sophia to become someone she had never imagined being. Someone capable of weaponizing disease, someone willing to sacrifice her own health and future, and someone who could execute a plan that required patience, deception, and the kind of cold calculation that seemed incompatible with her Catholic faith and Filipino cultural values about forgiveness and moving forward. The first 6 months after Maria's death, Sophia barely functioned. She continued working at her domestic position mechanically, sending money home to support her mother and remaining sister, but emotionally she was hollowed out. She attended Mass weekly but couldn't pray. The words stuck in her throat when she tried to recite prayers about forgiveness and divine justice. She stopped calling home regularly because hearing her mother's grief reopened wounds that never seemed to heal. But by September 2019, grief had crystallized into rage that demanded expression. Sophia began researching the Alnayan family obsessively, learning everything available about their business operations, family structure, social connections, and patterns of behavior. She discovered that Hamza and his older brother Omar were business partners in several real estate ventures, that they socialized frequently, and that Omar had a reputation within Filipino worker communities as someone who maintained multiple mistresses, usually domestic workers or service industry employees who were young, beautiful, and desperate enough to accept arrangements that combined financial support with sexual exploitation. Sophia's plan began forming gradually. She couldn't pursue legal justice. That avenue had been closed by corruption and indifference. She couldn't pursue physical violence. She lacked access, capability, and the stomach for direct killing. But she could pursue psychological and social destruction by striking at Omar's reputation, health, and family in ways that would cause suffering equal to what the Al Nahyan family had caused hers. The plan's brilliance was its cruel symmetry. Just as the Al Nahyan family had used their power to destroy Maria and escape consequences, Sophia would use their own patterns of exploitation against them, turning Omar's predatory behavior into the mechanism of his destruction. In March 2020, Sophia deliberately ended her domestic worker position, paying a financial penalty for early contract termination but freeing herself from sponsorship obligations that restricted her movement and activities. She found work at a high-end restaurant in DIFC, Dubai's International Financial Center, where the clientele included wealthy Emiratis and expatriates, and where her beauty and English fluency made her valuable to management-seeking staff who could interact gracefully with elite customers. The restaurant position was strategic. Sophia had learned through her research that Omar frequently dined at DIFC establishments, that he noticed attractive servers, and that he had a history of propositioning women in service positions with offers of financial support in exchange for sexual availability. She positioned herself perfectly to become his next target while making it appear that he was pursuing her rather than the reverse. But before initiating contact with Omar, Sophia needed to acquire the weapon that would make her revenge possible: HIV infection. This decision was the most difficult and irreversible part of her plan, deliberately contracting a life-threatening illness to use as a biological weapon against someone else. The moral and practical implications were staggering, and Sophia spent months wrestling with whether she could actually go through with actions that would destroy not just Omar but potentially herself. Her research into HIV was methodical. She learned about transmission rates during unprotected sex, approximately 0.04 to 1.4% per sexual encounter for insertive vaginal sex, higher for receptive anal sex, about the window period before detection, typically 18 to 45 days for most modern tests, about antiretroviral therapy that could suppress viral loads and extend life expectancy, and critically, about how to maximize transmission likelihood through tactics like engaging in sex during acute infection when viral loads were highest. Finding someone to infect her required entering communities she had never imagined engaging with. Through discreet inquiries in expat forums and eventually through direct requests in HIV-positive support groups, Sophia connected with a man, a Western expatriate living in Dubai who was HIV positive and who, after Sophia explained her situation and intentions with brutal honesty, agreed to have unprotected sex with her multiple times to ensure infection. His motivations for helping her remain unclear. Perhaps sympathy for her quest for justice, perhaps his own rage at wealthy people who escaped consequences, perhaps simply nihilistic willingness to participate in destruction. But over a period of 6 weeks in July and August 2020, Sophia had unprotected sex with this man approximately 15 times, eventually contracting HIV that was confirmed through testing in September 2020. The diagnosis brought Sophia to her lowest point psychologically. She had deliberately infected herself with a disease that would require lifelong medication, that carried significant social stigma, and that might eventually kill her despite modern treatments. She spent 3 days in her apartment unable to stop crying, questioning whether revenge was worth this irreversible price, whether Maria would have wanted this kind of justice. But ultimately, Sophia's rage overcame her doubt. She had already sacrificed her health for this plan. Abandoning it now would make that sacrifice meaningless. She began antiretroviral therapy to manage her infection, carefully timing her medication to keep her healthy enough to execute her plan while ensuring her viral load remained high enough to maximize Omar's infection risk. By December 2020, Sophia was ready to initiate the final phase, making herself irresistible to Sheikh Omar Al Nahyan and positioning herself to infect him with the patience and precision of someone who had spent nearly 2 years preparing for this moment. Sophia's first direct interaction with Sheikh Omar occurred on January 12, 2021, at the DIFC restaurant where she worked as a server. Omar had dined there several times previously, but Sophia had deliberately avoided being assigned to his table, waiting for the perfect moment to make herself memorable rather than simply available. That moment came when Omar was dining alone, unusual for him, suggesting he was between mistresses or at least between encounters. Sophia ensured she was assigned to his section, approaching his table with the professional warmth that elite restaurants demanded but adding subtle elements designed to capture his attention. Eye contact held slightly longer than necessary, a smile that suggested interest beyond mere customer service, questions about his preferences that felt personal rather than transactional. Omar noticed immediately. Men like him were trained to recognize when women were performing interest versus genuinely experiencing it, but Sophia's performance was flawless because it was built on real emotion, not attraction but hatred so intense it mimicked passion when channeled correctly. Their conversation that evening remained professional and brief, but Sophia planted seeds that would grow into his pursuit of her. She mentioned being new to this particular restaurant but having worked in service industries since arriving in Dubai. She subtly indicated she was single, struggling financially due to supporting family in the Philippines, and working 2 jobs to manage her expenses. Each detail was calculated to appeal to Omar's pattern of identifying vulnerable women who could be acquired through financial assistance disguised as generosity. Over the following weeks, Omar became a regular at the restaurant, always requesting Sophia's section, tipping excessively, and gradually escalating from professional courtesy to personal interest. He asked about her family, her life in Dubai, her aspirations. Sophia responded with carefully calibrated honesty, mentioning her sister's death 3 years earlier, without revealing it was Hamza who had killed her, her mother's financial struggles, her own loneliness in Dubai. By February 2021, Omar was explicitly propositioning her with the same pattern he had used on dozens of women before. He offered financial support, promised discretion, and presented the arrangement as mutually beneficial rather than exploitative. Sophia appeared reluctant initially, expressing concern about the morality of becoming involved with a married man, about the risks to her reputation and visa status. Her reluctance made Omar more determined. He increased the financial offer, provided a fully furnished apartment in Business Bay where she could live rent-free, and promised monthly allowances that would exceed anything she could earn legitimately. But most importantly, he promised confidentiality, complete secrecy that would protect both of them from social and legal consequences. Sophia appeared to struggle with the decision for weeks, creating the impression that she was torn between moral principles and financial desperation. This performance was critical. Omar needed to believe he was corrupting her rather than recognize that she was manipulating him. Men like Omar lost interest in easy conquests. They preferred the challenge of breaking down resistance and the power dynamic of transforming good girls into willing mistresses. Their physical relationship began in March 2021, approximately 14 months after Sophia's HIV infection and at a time when her viral load, despite antiretroviral therapy, remained sufficiently high to pose significant transmission risk. Sophia had deliberately adjusted her medication regimen in ways that maintained her health while maximizing her infectiousness, a calculation that required medical knowledge she had acquired through months of research. The first sexual encounter occurred in the Business Bay apartment Omar had rented for their affair. Sophia ensured that all sex was unprotected, claiming religious objections to contraception that Omar found charming in his own patronizing way, believing he was corrupting a good Catholic girl rather than recognizing he was being deliberately infected by someone who viewed her body as a weapon. Over the following months, their affair followed predictable patterns. Omar visited the apartment 2 or 3 times weekly, usually for encounters lasting 1 to 2 hours. He provided Sophia with a monthly allowance of 5,000 dirhams, paid all apartment expenses, and occasionally gave additional gifts of jewelry or cash when he felt particularly satisfied or guilty. To Omar, Sophia was another in his long series of mistresses. Beautiful, compliant, grateful for his financial support, and discreet about their arrangement. He had no reason to suspect that every encounter was deliberately designed to infect him, that her apparent passion was actually rage channeled into performance, and that she was methodically destroying his health while appearing to provide him sexual satisfaction. Sophia maintained this performance for 14 months, from March 2021 through May 2022. During this period, she had unprotected sex with Omar approximately 80 times, far more than necessary to ensure infection, but Sophia wanted to be absolutely certain that transmission occurred, and she wanted to maximize the viral load he received to increase the likelihood of aggressive disease progression. Throughout this period, Sophia continued managing her own HIV infection through modified antiretroviral therapy, maintained her restaurant employment to avoid suspicion, and sent money home to her mother and sister that came partly from her legitimate wages and partly from Omar's payments. Money that felt tainted, but that she rationalized as reparations for Maria's death. The psychological toll of this extended performance was devastating. Sophia was essentially living a double life, pretending to be Omar's grateful mistress while actually being his would-be executioner, maintaining an affair that required her to be intimate with someone she loathed, and waiting patiently for the moment when he would discover the infection and realize too late that his exploitation of vulnerable women had finally met consequences he couldn't pay to avoid. That moment came in October 2022 when Omar underwent routine health screening as part of a life insurance application. The HIV test result was positive, and Sophia's years of planning had finally achieved their objective. She had infected the brother of her sister's killer with a disease that would destroy his reputation, devastate his family, and potentially end his life despite modern treatments. Sheikh Omar Al Nahyan's initial response to his HIV diagnosis was denial so complete that his doctors spent 2 weeks conducting confirmatory tests before he could accept the results were accurate. He had always been careful with his health, underwent regular medical checkups, and believed his wealth provided insulation from diseases associated with poverty and carelessness. The diagnosis shattered his self-image and forced him to confront that his behavior had finally produced consequences his money couldn't eliminate. His second response was tracing the infection source through systematic review of his sexual history. His wife Noura hadn't been tested positive. They had infrequent sexual contact and always used protection due to his affair patterns, ruling her out as either source or victim. His previous mistress had been tested after he contacted her and was negative, as were several other recent partners he reached out to through carefully worded inquiries. That left Sophia, the mistress he had maintained for the past 14 months and who had always insisted on unprotected sex. When he finally contacted her in late October 2022 to inform her of his diagnosis and demand she get tested, Sophia's response was calm and controlled. "I already know my status, Omar. I've known for much longer than you have." The implication was clear, but he initially refused to believe it. She had knowingly infected him. Omar's rage was volcanic. He threatened legal prosecution, social destruction, deportation, everything his power could inflict. But Sophia's response was devastating in its simplicity. "Do you remember Maria Reyes? She was my sister. She fell from your brother's balcony 3 years ago after he tried to rape her. Your family paid blood money to make the investigation go away. I've spent 3 years making sure you understand that some debts can't be settled with cash." The revelation transformed Omar's rage into something more complex: fear, shame, and dawning recognition that he had been systematically deceived and destroyed by someone whose sister's death he had been complicit in covering up. His involvement had been peripheral, providing legal assistance to help Hamza avoid prosecution. But Sophia viewed all Al Nahyan family members as collectively responsible for Maria's death and for the system that had allowed it to be dismissed as an unfortunate accident. Omar faced impossible choices. Reporting Sophia to police would require publicly acknowledging his HIV status and his affair, destroying his reputation and potentially his marriage. His wife would learn about his infidelity, his children would face social stigma, and his business relationships would suffer from the scandal. But not reporting her meant allowing her to escape accountability for what was clearly deliberate infection, a crime under UAE law that carried significant prison sentences. He initially attempted negotiation, offering Sophia money to leave the country quietly without public scandal. She refused, explaining that money was irrelevant to her objectives and that public scandal was actually part of her plan. She wanted his family destroyed as completely as hers had been. The police investigation that followed was initiated not by Omar but by Sophia herself, who walked into Dubai Police Headquarters on November 3, 2022, and confessed to deliberately infecting Sheikh Omar Al Nahyan with HIV as revenge for her sister's death. Her confession was detailed, documented, and delivered with such calm that the investigating officers initially wondered if she was mentally disturbed. But psychological evaluation determined Sophia was entirely competent and rational. She simply had committed acts that seemed irrational because most people couldn't comprehend the depth of rage required to deliberately infect oneself with HIV in order to weaponize that infection against someone else. Her confession included detailed documentation, medical records proving her infection timeline, communications with the man who had infected her at her request, diary entries describing her planning process, and a 47-page written statement explaining her motives, methods, and complete lack of remorse for her actions. The case created extraordinary legal and ethical complications. Sophia was clearly guilty of deliberately transmitting a serious disease, a crime under UAE Federal Law No. 14 of 2014 on combating communicable diseases. But her confession also reopened questions about Maria's death and the Al Nahyan family's role in covering up what appeared to be at minimum negligent homicide and potentially murder. Public opinion fractured along predictable lines. Many viewed Sophia as a calculating criminal who had committed an unforgivable act regardless of her motives. Others saw her as a desperate woman driven to extreme measures by a justice system that had failed her completely. Filipino advocacy organizations struggled with how to respond, condemning her methods while acknowledging the systemic failures that had made legal justice impossible. Omar was forced to inform his wife about both his infidelity and his HIV status, a conversation that ended his marriage and his relationship with his children, who were horrified by both his betrayal and his diagnosis. His business partners distanced themselves, several contracts were terminated, and his social position collapsed with the speed that comes when scandal attaches to someone whose status was always more fragile than their wealth suggested. The trial that followed would force Dubai to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and whether a system that fails victims completely can then claim moral authority to prosecute those victims when they seek justice through illegal means. The trial of Sophia Reyes began on March 14, 2023, in Dubai Criminal Court, and immediately became one of the most discussed criminal cases in UAE history. Prosecutors charged Sophia with deliberate transmission of HIV, carrying potential 10-year sentence, assault causing grievous harm, and criminal conspiracy. They sought maximum sentences, characterizing her actions as premeditated, methodical, and utterly lacking in legal or moral justification, regardless of her family's tragedy. Sophia's defense team, funded partly by Filipino advocacy organizations and partly by crowdfunding from overseas Filipino workers worldwide who viewed her as either hero or victim, pursued a strategy that was simultaneously pragmatic and revolutionary. They didn't dispute the facts of what Sophia had done. Instead, they challenged the system that had made her actions seem like the only available path to justice. The defense presented extensive evidence about Maria's death, the suspicious circumstances, the cursory investigation, the blood money payment that closed the case, and the pattern of similar incidents involving domestic workers whose deaths were routinely attributed to accidents without thorough examination. They argued that Sophia had exhausted all legal remedies before resorting to her extreme method of seeking justice. Most controversially, they introduced testimony from other domestic workers who had experienced violence, sexual assault, and exploitation by members of prominent families, incidents that were never seriously investigated because the legal system systematically devalued foreign workers' lives and testimonies. This testimony wasn't legally relevant to Sophia's guilt, but was strategically important for shifting public perception and demonstrating the systemic failures that had shaped Sophia's actions. The prosecution objected strenuously to this trial of the system approach, arguing that Sophia's guilt for deliberate HIV transmission was clear and that her sister's death, tragic as it was, provided no legal justification for her crimes. They presented medical experts who testified about the severity of HIV infection, the psychological trauma of diagnosis, and the life-altering consequences Sophia had deliberately inflicted on Omar. Omar himself testified reluctantly, forced to publicly acknowledge his affair and his diagnosis. His testimony was defensive and unsympathetic. He portrayed himself as a victim of deception without acknowledging his pattern of exploiting vulnerable women. Under cross-examination, the defense forced him to admit to multiple affairs with domestic workers and service employees, his awareness of his brother's sexual harassment of Maria before her death, and his role in providing legal assistance that helped close Maria's investigation as accidental death. The trial's most powerful moment came when Sophia herself testified. Speaking clearly and without apparent emotion, she described her 3-year journey from grief to rage to methodical planning and execution. She acknowledged the criminality of her actions but refused to express remorse in the way the court expected. "I know what I did was illegal," she said from the witness stand. "I know I will go to prison for many years. I know many people will condemn me, But I also know that Maria's death would have meant nothing without my actions. The Alnayan family killed my sister and paid money to make it disappear. Your system protected them and failed her. So I created my own justice. When asked if she understood that her actions had infected Omar with a potentially life-threatening disease, Sophia responded with chilling calmness. Yes, just as his family took my sister's life, I took his health. Just as they destroyed my family, I destroyed his reputation and marriage. The symmetry seems appropriate. The prosecution argued this demonstrated clear criminal intent and lack of remorse that warranted maximum sentencing. The defense argued it demonstrated a woman broken by grief and systemic failure, who had been driven to extreme measures by the complete absence of legitimate justice options. The verdict, delivered on May 22, 2023, found Sophia guilty on all charges but with significant mitigating factors acknowledged. She was sentenced to 8 years in prison, less than the maximum but substantial enough to satisfy demands for accountability. The judge's statement accompanying the verdict was remarkably candid about the complexity. The defendant's actions were criminal, premeditated, and caused serious harm that cannot be excused regardless of her family's tragedy. However, this court acknowledges that the defendant's actions occurred within a context of systemic failures that denied her family justice through legitimate means. While this does not excuse her crimes, it provides understanding of how a rational person might be driven to such extreme measures. Additionally, Sophia was ordered to pay 50,000 dirhams in compensation to Omar, a token amount given his wealth but symbolically important for maintaining legal principles about accountability. The verdict satisfied almost no one completely but acknowledged the messy reality that Sophia was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, that her actions were both understandable and indefensible, and that the system's failure to provide justice for Maria had contributed to creating the conditions under which Sophia's revenge became thinkable. Sophia Reyes currently serves her sentence in Dubai Central Prison, where she maintains her HIV treatment regimen and reportedly displays no signs of regret about her actions. She has become a controversial figure within Filipino communities, viewed by some as a cautionary tale about revenge destroying the avenger, by others as a hero who finally made powerful people face consequences for their treatment of vulnerable workers. Sheikh Omar Al-Nahyan's life was destroyed as completely as Sophia intended. His marriage ended in divorce, his children refused contact with him, his business reputation never recovered from the scandal, and he lives in relative isolation managing his HIV infection while facing social stigma that his wealth cannot eliminate. His brother Hamza, whose actions precipitated the entire tragedy, faced no legal consequences but reportedly suffers from paranoia and fear that he might be Sophia's next target, though she has indicated she has no further revenge plans. The case prompted some reforms to domestic worker protections in UAE, including mandatory investigations when workers die in circumstances that could suggest violence, requirements that blood money payments not preclude criminal investigation, and better enforcement of existing labor protections. But advocates note that implementation remains inconsistent and that the fundamental kafala system creating worker vulnerability persists. Maria's mother Elena received some of the crowdfunding donations that had been raised for Sophia's defense, allowing her finally to erect a proper memorial for Maria with a marble headstone bearing her photograph and an inscription. Taken too soon, never forgotten, justice delayed but never denied. Whether Sophia's actions actually constituted justice remains a question without clear answer. The ethical questions the case raises are profound and uncomfortable. Does systematic denial of justice justify victims taking justice into their own hands through illegal means? If legal systems consistently fail vulnerable populations, what moral authority do those systems have to prosecute people who seek justice through alternative means? Was Sophia a vigilante achieving legitimate justice through criminal methods, or simply a criminal whose tragic backstory doesn't excuse her deliberate infection of another person with a serious disease? Can we condemn Sophia's methods while acknowledging that the system's failures made those methods predictable if not inevitable? These questions have no easy answers, and different moral frameworks produce different conclusions. What remains clear is that Sophia's story, and Maria's death that precipitated it, reveals systemic failures that create the conditions under which people believe they must choose between accepting injustice or becoming criminals themselves to achieve any accountability. Subscribe if you believe these stories matter. because Sophia's case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, revenge, and the human cost of legal systems that protect the powerful while abandoning the vulnerable. Share this with someone who needs to understand that when justice systems fail completely, they create vigilantes. Whether those vigilantes are heroes or criminals depends partly on perspective and partly on whether we're willing to examine the failures that created them. And remember, Maria Reyes deserved justice through legitimate means. Sophia Reyes deserved a system that would provide that justice without requiring her to destroy herself in pursuit of accountability. Neither received what they deserved. That's the real tragedy underlying this entire case.